On the evening of October 31st, 1968, a group of young vandals snuck onto the grounds of Tottenham Park Cemetery. They took flowers from nearby graves and arranged them in geometric patterns, arranging them on a path leading to a coffin they had dug up from a fresh grave. The coffin was opened and the body inside disturbed. But their most macabre act was driving an iron stake in form across through the lid and into the chest of the corpse. Though the identities and motivations of those responsible were never determined, general consensus at the time linked the desecration to an occult ritual, and this was only one of several similar cases that occurred in the area at that time. What was driving people in the area to commit such disturbing acts? In today's episode, we will look into the Highgate vampire case. Highgate Cemetery is a beautiful Victorian cemetery near to Hampstead Heath. Highgate Cemetery has some of the finest funerary architecture in the country. It is a place of peaceful contemplation where trees, memorials, and wildlife flourish. The cemetery featured tombstones so ornate that it was as though the dead were trying to show one another up. However, after World War II, it fell into significant disrepair. By the 1960s, the cemetery had fallen into such a state of dilapidation that it was the setting for multiple horror movies, such as From Beyond the Grave and Taste the Blood of Dracula. In the late 1960s, people began telling stories of seeing a dark figure with blood-red or glowing eyes gliding through the cemetery. In some, he wore a hat. In 1967, two adolescent girls walking near Swains Lane claimed to have seen a vampire rising from a grave near the Highgate Cemetery's north end. They understandably ran, and perhaps less understandably, did not seem to mention this sighting until the Highgate vampire became a media mainstay. Another witness said that something cold and clinging touching her hand had woken her one night. The following day, she found marks on that hand. Then, dead animals began being found in the cemetery. These were likely either killed by other animals or killed by teenagers playing satanic pranks. In addition to the tall man in a hat, people saw a multitude of spectral figures. A woman in a white dress, a disembodied face snarling through the cemetery's wrought iron fence, strange creatures in the pond, and even a phantom bicyclist. In an interview with Hampstead and Highgate News, David Farrant, a self-proclaimed wizard and Wiccan priest, who served as the president of the Psychic and Occult Society, claimed that, on Christmas Eve in 1969, he had seen a gray figure floating through the cemetery and found the bodies of several foxes drained of blood, with their throats lacerated. Farrant did not believe that they were dealing with your typical horror movie vampire, but something more likely to be a ghost or spirit. After reading David Farrant's story in Hampstead and Highgate News, a man by the name of Sean Manchester, who was the president of the British Occult Society, which he founded, and believed himself to be an exorcist and vampire slayer, offered to give his opinion to the newspaper. In an article titled, "Does a Vampire Walk in Highgate?" Manchester could not let Farrant's flippant blasphemy about the nature of this abomination stand. This was no mere vampire, but a king vampire, a practitioner of the dark arts from medieval Wallachia. Thus began a decades-long feud between David Farrant, the wizard, and Sean Manchester, the vampire slayer. On Friday, March 13, 1969, a television program was aired featuring the two vampire slayers. The show featured a segment being broadcast live from just outside the gates of Highgate Cemetery. This caused a mob of would-be vampire hunters to descend upon the cemetery. Unprepared for such a large crowd, police tried to keep the crowd back, but a number of people managed to scale the walls and gain entry to the cemetery. Thankfully, no injuries were suffered, but a large number of people reported seeing the figure of the vampire lurking amongst the headstones. As the media ramped up its coverage on what has now become known as the Highgate Vampire, both David Farrant and Sean Manchester each claimed that they would rid the world of this terrifying entity. Tensions grew between them, as each wanted to be the one to successfully vanquish the Hightower vampire. It came to the point where they began to exchange insults with each other through the media. At one point, David Farrant was caught wandering the cemetery late one night carrying a wooden stake. He was arrested and charged with trespassing. The rivalry between Farrant and Manchester hit its peak in 1973, when the pair announced that they would engage in a magical duel to settle their differences. You heard that right, an actual duel, although what weapons would be involved was never made clear. In the end, cooler heads prevailed, and the duel was eventually called off. As interest in the Highgate Vampire began to wane over the decades, so too did the public's interest in the feud between the vampire slayers. However, the animosity between the two never wavered. Their feud lasted until David Farrant's death in 2019. Since Farrant's death, Sean Manchester has remained quiet about the feud, declining to answer any questions regarding that subject. However, Manchester does assert that he is the ultimate vampire slayer, and everything he has to say on the matter of his feud with Farrant can be found in his book. This concludes today's episode of the Paranormal Report. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a thumbs up and consider subscribing to our channel. It is due to your continued viewership and support that we are able to bring you interesting and informative videos like this. The team here at the Paranormal Report really appreciates your support.